Received a BA in religion from Barnard in 1962, MA in philosophy and religion in '64 from Columbia. Following her retirement from being the personal assistant to Elie Wiesel, she moved to Chapel Hill. Martha's presentation today is on 3 decades of working with Elie Wiesel. How about a warm welcome for Martha Hauptman? How's that, Martha?
How many of you have read Elie Wiesel's book, Night? Oh my goodness. How many of you have read other Elie Wiesel books after Night? Oh, this is great, okay. Most people do not know that he's written more than 60 books. Fiction, nonfiction, a cantata set to music by Darius Milhaud. He's written plays, and this last weekend I was up in Boston. Because the archivist in the library at Boston University discovered a play that was never published. It was an unknown play, and I went up to see a play reading. People have always asked me, well, what did you do? So the first part will be about me and what I did, and obviously there'll be a crossover. And then the second part will be really about things that you probably don't know about him. So I saw in the Boston Globe in 1976 that Elie Wiesel was coming to Boston University, and I had studied philosophy of religion. I had read all of his books to date because he produces something like a book every year or two, and they're all written in French. That's one fact that maybe you don't all know. They start off in French, and it takes a year again. So I decided I would my kids were in school. I decided I would take that class. So I sort of talked my way into his first class in the fall of '76 at Boston University. It was a class on the Holocaust, which he never taught again. He leaves it for younger scholars to teach because it takes too much out of him. He never teaches the Holocaust, and most people think that's the field. But he teaches courses on literature of memory. So I talked my way in as an auditor to this class, which was, no one really set a limit, so it was a huge class, huge. Thereafter, it became a seminar, and the seminar was probably one of the larger seminars ever at a university. It was about 50 to 60 people sitting around a table, and we'd always pull in chairs because I didn't have the heart to turn students away. One of my tasks, and I kind of took it on myself to do, was to interview every student that ever came to take his classes. I felt that it was important that he have a good mix of people, and I felt like it was important for the students who were in the business school at BU or the law school or the med school to have a chance to take this humanities seminar, because it would change who they were in the business world, or people in the School of Theology were going to be speaking from pulpits and would cherish that experience with Wiesel, and that was true. So that was one of the things I did, and I will talk some soon about the students, because for me that was equal to the privilege of working with him, with the students who came to the class and became lifetime friends of mine. The phone, I could have had a work-study student answering the phone. After all, answering the phone, what does that take? But that was one of my favorite things, because you never knew who was at the other end. I remember one day I picked up the phone and this voice said, "Hello, this is Yves Montand. I'd like to speak to Elie Wiesel." And then he starts explaining to me who he is, and I said, "I know who you are." So, and the Élysée Palace would call, the White House would call. I mean, I just loved picking up the phone, and sometimes the language would be French, sometimes it would be German, sometimes it would be Yiddish, which I really don't know. I know a little bit of German. My language skills improved with the job. And let me just say that the job was listed in that summer of '76. I was looking at job listings thinking maybe I'd go back to work. And it was listed as the Mellon, as a secretary, that's what it was, Mellon secretary, competence in written French required. Well, I hadn't used the French language since college days, which were far behind me, and high school French, but I did take French in college. And so I didn't apply for the job. I just took the class in that fall. And fast forward, he said to me, "Why didn't you come to me earlier?" Because the person who was hired knew no French. In fact, he didn't know who Elie Wiesel was, really, and he made so many mistakes that he quit in January, and I was in the right place at the right time. That's how I walked into the job. And my French improved over time because he wrote everything in French. And he would have me edit the French, the English translations, because whenever you see something by Elie Wiesel, let's say in a newspaper or a book review, or you see anything of his in a newspaper, there would be in-house translators, or translators would be assigned to translate these small pieces. And I would take the French, and he would have me edit the English. And there was one time, I think it was the Chicago Tribune there was a review in the Chicago Tribune of a book by about Janusz Korczak. And I was rewriting the whole thing, and somebody else had his name on it and was getting paid for it. So I sort of got brave, and I said to Elie, "You know what, why can't I try just doing the translation from scratch?" And he let me do that, and there are a few things over there on my show and tell table that were translated by me, articles that he wrote in a biblical journal. And so then there was the correspondence, voluminous, especially after he won the Nobel Prize in 1986. I was working for him from 77 to 86, almost 10 years before he won the Nobel Prize. He was known because he had written a lot, but not as known all over the world as he became after 86. A lot of his books were translated into Norwegian, into German. Actually, Night was translated into more than 30 languages. But it was only when Oprah took him on that it got onto the New York Times bestseller list many decades after it was written. Night was written in the French was 1958. And Oprah had him on a program. Well, let me go back to the Oprah story. That was one of those things where I answered the phone, and it was Oprah's assistant. They wanted Elie Wiesel to come to Chicago. I don't know if you know, her program was broadcast from Chicago. And he had no idea who Oprah Winfrey was. I mean, does Elie Wiesel watch Oprah on TV? I mean, he doesn't watch TV. So he said no. He said, I don't have time in my schedule. So, boy, was he sorry, because what happened was she tried several times, and then she said, well, I'll come to his home in New York. And they made a TV studio out of his living room. Let me tell you, they were very sorry. And I flew down from Boston to New York, and I was there, and she did her homework. It was really wonderful. 10 years later, she did another program about him, and that's the one maybe has anyone seen the Oprah program with Wiesel? And so the Night went on to the bestseller list, and it was on for #1 on the bestseller list of nonfiction. And it stayed on for weeks and weeks until they decided that it was considered a classic. When you're a classic, you get off. Like To Kill a Mockingbird didn't stay on longer than a certain amount of time. So that was it. And then Oprah decided that she wanted to go to Auschwitz with him to see what that was all about. They went on her birthday in January to Auschwitz. And she did that as part of her program. 10 years after that first program, she has Elie Wiesel guiding her in Auschwitz. So after that first class, even though I had tons of work and it was no longer Mellon's secretary, I became Well, I was really administrative assistant, personal assistant, editorial assistant. Because of my background, he saw that he could give me more responsibility in lots of different areas. But one of my favorite things was sitting in on his classes, because no matter how much work I had, that to me was the biggest benefit of working for him. I sat in on every single class over 27 years. And the good thing about that too was that I got to know all the students whom I had interviewed and admitted to the classes. So when they needed recommendations, I knew how good they were because they did presentations in the class and they spoke in discussions. So here's a story about a student, one of my favorites. Reinhold had corresponded with Elie Wiesel from Stuttgart, Germany, and there was a lot of correspondence. And one day, Reinhold just shows up in the office in August, not knowing that at Boston University there's pre-registration in the month of April and the class is closed, it comes in August. But I looked at his eyes and I looked at his face, blonde, blue-eyed, on fire. He came to study with the master, which is what a lot of European students do. You're a disciple, you come and you study with the master. So I, of course, had to make an exception and I let him in. So we pulled another chair in the seminar. The seminar was listed in the catalog as for 40 students, and it often was 60 in a seminar room. So Reinhold became his devotee, his protege. Reinhold is now has a project in Germany where he is translating all of Elie Wiesel's work into German. And in 1998, Reinhold decided that, no, it wasn't 1998, 1995, 50 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, 50 years after the end of World War II, Reinhold decided there should be a conference in Germany for teachers to study the work of Elie Wiesel. He thought that was an important thing to do. And he invited me to give a paper. And I looked at him, I said, Reinhold, I haven't written a paper since college days, graduate school. And he said, well, you have to come, you'll do it. So I did, and that was my first trip to Germany. And it was amazing because the other people who were invited were all the scholars and professors who ever wrote about Wiesel or taught Wiesel. And I only knew them from the files or the phone by name. And here I was meeting all of them, and they knew who I was. So it was just great. It was really great. And then there's another story that involves Reinhold. Two young women, Bettina, a poet, and Angela, an artist, also corresponded with Wiesel and wanted to come and visit his class. No, they just were writing and wanted to visit his class. And I said, well, why don't you come when his obligation was to give 3 lectures over the course of his academic year, usually in the fall. And they came, and we became friends, and I told them, you have to meet Reinhold. Well, Elie Wiesel was going to speak in the Bundestag on International Holocaust Day, and I told them about it. I just felt they should know. So they saw to it that they got to that speech in the lower house of parliament in Berlin with Reinhold, and they met each other, and it was wonderful. And I just want to read something from wasn't Bettina, Michaela. We met Reinhold in the Bundestag, and we saw Wiesel and his wife after Wiesel's speech. It was yet surprising that we 4 people were the only to be with Wiesel, his wife, and friends at the moment after the speech. No politicians showed up. We don't know why. Maybe Wiesel had said he wanted to be alone. Then they did a tour of the building, and she says, Reinhold was at his best to connect everybody. With his naive and irresistible charms, he even introduced me to Marion Wiesel. and comic of situation, introduced me as a wonderful poet whose book he had just read in the night train on his way to Berlin, and he was still entirely enthusiastic about it. So the afternoon turned out to be excellent under Martha's motto, "You must meet Reinhold," and "You must meet Angela and Michaela." Everything was like you had foreseen. Now, one of my favorite things, those of you who know me as who I am here, one of my favorite most things is to bring people together. And last year, I had the privilege of going to a dedication of a bust of Wiesel that two former students had arranged with a sculptor who's done the Pope and Dalai Lama, a really man of reputation from Connecticut. They were unveiling this sculpture. I had been to their wedding some years before, and I had made an exception in both of their cases when I interviewed them. He was from Harvard Law School. She was a second year at Boston University, and the seminar was an upper-level seminar. And I made the decision that they should be in the class. So it was a shidduch. I made the shidduch. They came to the class, and lo and behold, they got married, and I went to the wedding, and when I saw them last fall, they said, "When you come and visit your son in LA, you must come stay with us. We have a guest cottage on our property in San Diego, where you can stay as long as you want." So I just did that in January, and here are their two gorgeous little boys, and they say to them, "If not for Miss Martha, you wouldn't be here." And they, of course, didn't know what they were talking about. But it's that kind of thing that I just love to do, to stay in touch with the students. And then these two didn't know that there was another Wiesel student in La Jolla, which is very close by. But I remembered that this person whose wedding I was invited to in Mexico City, which I couldn't go to because of my asthma, my doctor said, "You're not going to Mexico City." But I knew she lived in La Jolla, and I had never met the husband. And I thought, they should meet each other. That would be great, two former students of Wiesel's. So we met for brunch, all of us, and they knew people in the Jewish community in common. They had a lot of friends in common, and I know they're going to be friends now. That's what I love to do. So, another thing, when I was getting ready to retire, there were many people who didn't know, but there was one woman, an Irish music teacher out in Dublin, who for years was calling Wiesel to please come to the Tzipora Music Festival. Tzipora was Elie Wiesel's youngest sister, who went up in smoke with her mother on the day of arrival in Auschwitz. His two older sisters did survive. Well, they named this music festival the Tzipora Music Festival, so clearly this teacher was dying to have Elie Wiesel come, and he just could not get Ireland on his schedule. So she said to me, "How am I going to reach you if you're retiring?" I said, "Well, I'll give you my contact information." She said, "Why don't you come to the Tzipora Festival next time it happens?" So I did, and I was put up in a 13th century castle, and I made sure that Wiesel gave me a copy of his memoirs to sign it to her, and so that was another special thing for me, very special. Bernadette Hayden. There was, again about students, the devotion of his students that I saw was really something that, I know there are a lot of people who've been faculty members, but I'm not sure that this ever happened to you. There was a pregnant law student, very pregnant, and she was in his class that met once a week, Monday and then another Monday and another Monday. Well, she gave birth between the two Mondays and showed up on the second Monday, 40 hours after the baby was born, and she brought her son to the class, not to miss a class. Then there was the student who came 2 hours on a train from Brown University in Providence to Boston University for an 8:30 a.m. class. Her fellow students thought she was nuts, but they didn't understand what it meant to her. So, on his 60th birthday, I conceived of the idea that the thing that mattered most to him in his teaching were his students. And so I had my work study work with me on getting together a collection of letters from former students who he had taught. That was a period of about 10 years. He was born in 1928, September 30th, 1928. So he will be 87, God willing, this September. So I got this collection of letters, and that's what I presented him for his 60th birthday. For his 80th birthday in Boston, there was a colloquium, and I did a talk at the Hillel. And for his 70th birthday, there was a colloquium with people like Saul Bellow was on the faculty at that time at Boston University, and Cynthia Ozick came, and very prominent people in a lot of different disciplines. And I thought, you know, these big things are wonderful, but I'm going to do a little something in the office. And so I asked my favorite people, students and friends of his, faculty friends, to come in for a little party so we could schmooze. And Debbie Kachko, who is a cantor in Ridgefield, Connecticut, came with her traveling guitar. And she, we have a CD of it, so what I want you to hear is what happened in the office at that party when he walked into the office. And hopefully we'll get the Yom Huledet. And one of the things you don't know about him is that he sings. Now the next voice you hear will be him. We hope.
Vayitrakenu b'tzadeinu, shepshimenu zachalanu, vayitrakenu b'tzadeinu, shepshimenu zachalanu, shepshimenu zachalanu, kiveyom chasdu. Shepshimenu zachalanu, shepshimenu zachalanu, kiveyom chasdu. Zachalanu, kiveyom
Is that clear back there? Or is it low? Make it a little lower, please.
Zachalanu, kiveyom chasdu.
The comment from his friend Irving Abramson from Chicago, who collected 3 volumes of Elie's work, was Boston University will never be the same. Okay, so one of his favorite things to say, and he would say it over and over again, is the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And Heschel and Saul Lieberman were his teachers in New York. Since you've read so much of his work, I'm kind of assuming that you know the history, but maybe I'll give a little bit of it so that maybe there's something you don't know. He was born in Siget, which was which switched from Hungary to Romania. He said he knew what country he was in by what national anthem they sang in school, because it kept going back and forth. And in 1944, the Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. Now, 44, think of it. The world knew, everybody knew. Nobody warned the Hungarian Jews to not go on those trains. If they had, Wiesel said his family, which was, I guess they were middle class, they had a servant, or you call her a maid, who had a little hut in the mountains, in the Carpathian Mountains, and she said to them, come, I can put you in my cottage, my hut. And his father, who was a major player in the community, didn't think anything really was going to happen. I mean, he really didn't believe it, even though he was a major figure in the community. And I think the son, Elie Wiesel, learned from the father, because the father spent his life helping people. But when Maria offered them a haven, he just didn't pay attention. So, and Elie would say that, had we known, well, obviously we could have gone. A lot of the people could have gone to the mountains. Siget is in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, so it would have been easy for a lot of people to just vanish and not be taken. So, the Auschwitz year, it was 11 months that he was in Auschwitz, and then Buchenwald. His mother and sister, as I said, were killed on the day of arrival, and his father died in Buchenwald. He said he really didn't care if he lived or died after his father died, and he had some time to go. The liberation was shortly after his father died, so if he had only hung on a few more months, he would have made it. And then the liberators came, and he was liberated April 11th, 1945. And we just passed the anniversary, 70 years ago. And the orphans were put on a train through Europe. It's on a train. And when they got into France, de Gaulle had made some gesture of offering French citizenship to these people on the children on the train. And a lot of the kids, raised their hands, but Elie said he didn't know French, so he had no idea what this offer was, so he did not raise his hand. So he did not have citizenship until 1963, when he got American citizenship. He never had a passport before that. But he did land in Paris, or in France. There was a home for orphan children, run by an organization called OSE. His sister, one of his older sisters, saw a photograph of him as one of the children in that place, because he had no idea if any of his family survived. She found him, and they met in Paris, and you can imagine what a meeting that was. So that sister is still, I think she's still alive. The other sister married a doctor in Canada, and she died of cancer some time ago. But he's in Paris, and he's 16 going on 17, and very, he had no money, so he taught Hebrew, and he was a choir director. Music was his thing, and in fact, he talks about whether he wanted to study music or philosophy. He became a journalist for the Israeli newspaper Yediot Ahronot, and he did work for them in Paris, and then they sent him to New York to cover the United Nations, at which point he met Golda Meir, and he's actually known all the prime ministers of Israel, known meaning that he had conversations with all the prime ministers of Israel, from Golda Meir to Netanyahu. And all the presidents of the United States, from Carter on, Republican, Democrat, because whenever there was a White House dinner with visiting dignitaries who mattered to the Jewish world, Elie Wiesel would be on the guest list. And he used opportunities with presidents you may have seen newspaper coverage where Elie Wiesel spoke truth to power. And here are two examples. One was, He was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, which is awarded by both houses of Congress, unanimous vote of both houses of Congress. And he went to the White House to receive this from President Reagan. And it was a perfect opportunity to tell President Reagan not to go to Bitburg. Many of you may have seen that on TV, because it was covered. He told Reagan, your place, Mr. President, is with the victims, not with the perpetrators, because the cemetery at Bitburg had Nazis buried there. And unfortunately, Reagan went anyway, and he invited Elie to go with him on his plane on Air Force One, but of course Elie did not go. So that was one occasion. Another occasion was whenever victims suffered, Wiesel, the journalist in him, and the survivor in him, needed to go to give his presence to these people who were suffering. So he went to Bosnia and witnessed what was going on there. And as luck would have it, shortly after that, there was the dedication of the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I'm going to tell you a story about that that's fun, that I'm sure you don't know. But let me just say, he used the occasion of the dedication of the museum to turn to President Clinton and say, Mr. President, you need to do something in Bosnia. You need to do something. I've been there and I've seen what's going on there. And it was shortly after that that Clinton did send troops to Bosnia. He was in Israel on one of his many trips, and by the way, he never lived in Israel, and he doesn't have a residence in Paris. He's always stayed at hotels in either of those places. And some Israelis really don't like the fact that he never became an Israeli, never lived in Israel. Now, I got to know his first boss, Noach Moses, the son of the first publisher of Yediot Achronot. And Noach Moses said, if Elie had been an Israeli, he would have been just another Israeli. He wouldn't have had the kind of power in the Jewish world that he had by becoming an American citizen. He just did so much more, and I'll continue with that in a minute. So he was in Israel on one of his many trips, and one day he gets a call from Stu Eisenstadt, who was an assistant, who was a liaison to the president. And Stu Eisenstadt said, why are you not answering the calls from the White House? And Elie said, I thought it was a hoax. I thought it was a joke. He kept getting messages from the desk that the White House was calling him. And it turns out that Carter wanted to talk to him. This goes way back. President Carter wanted to speak with him. Okay, so Elie said, all right. So Eisenstadt said, well, why don't you, when you come back, and I'm going to make an appointment for you to see President Carter. So he came back from Israel and went to the White House directly. So he had called Wiesel to chair the U.S. Commission on the Holocaust, which predated the Holocaust Memorial Council. So this is 1978. He's sitting with the president, and he really didn't want to do it. He said, I'll think about it. What's to think about, His friends convinced him that it was something to do for memory, and memory is one of his watchwords. So while he's sitting with Carter, Carter says, I have something to show you. Takes out a file and opens a map, and it's an aerial map that the US bombers had, an aerial map showing Auschwitz, the whole thing, everything. The bombers at that time were bombing factories around Auschwitz, but they knew what was going on. Carter thought Wiesel would be delighted to see this, and of course he was totally offended. They thought the Americans didn't know what was going on. They could see the crematoria, they could see, visualize the entire thing, the barracks, they could see people. And Carter was sort of taken aback that Wiesel wasn't delighted to see this map. So he did take on the responsibility of the commission, the chair of the commission. Now, I've said in previous speeches, if Carter thought Elie Wiesel was going to recommend, Carter really wanted a monument Just want another monument. Now, Wiesel wanted something more monumental, a teaching institution, not a monument, not another stone edifice. So he conceived of the idea of the museum. So then the question was raising funds to build a museum. And then they looked at buildings that were not being used, and this doesn't make it into the literature or the historical literature, but I was there, so I remember that there were some buildings that kind of gave you a good feeling of what it was like to be in a confined space, small, and those buildings were offered for this museum. But then they decided, no, they're going to start from scratch. So there was a competition for architects, and the building that you have, how many people have visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington? And it's just a wonderful structure, I think, and really they did a great job. So that's the story of and then of course there were debates about what would go on in there, and Wiesel conceived of the idea of a day of remembrance. This goes back to late 1970s. He created the Day of Remembrance, so every state of the country has a Holocaust Memorial Day. The governor does a proclamation, and I don't know if they're all as active as others, but I know my friend Sheva Zucker said that North Carolina had it from the beginning, did it from the beginning, and I've gone to some of the commemorations at Meredith College, and they're really incredible. So now, some of you may know that he was asked to be president of Israel. And recently, actually, Netanyahu wanted him to be president of Israel, but it went back years earlier. He was asked to be president of Israel, and he answered at a press conference, "Why do people come to me? For one reason alone. I have nothing except words." No, that's why he said no to being president. And it was for one reason alone. I have nothing except words, but they are mine. The moment I become president of Israel, they no longer are. So when he was asked the second time, now it's the same thing. "Leave me alone, I write books," he said. That was his answer to Netanyahu offering him the presidency of Israel. On the wall of the museum, if you've been there, maybe you noticed it, maybe you didn't, it's right when you come in. On the wall are these words of his. "Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget the little faces of the children, whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget that nocturnal silence which deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget these things, even if I am condemned to live as long as God himself. Never." That's on the wall of the museum. That's from Night. And you can't believe how many letters he has gotten from children who want him to believe in God. How can you not believe in God anymore? Well, that was a misinterpretation. Even though it sounds like the book was closed, it was not. And I'm going to just read one more thing here. Yes, okay. There is a passage in Night recounting the hanging of a young Jewish boy that has given rise to an interpretation bordering on blasphemy. Theorists of the idea that God is dead have used my words unfairly as justification of their rejection of faith. But if Nietzsche could cry out to the old man in the forest that God is dead, the Jew in me cannot. I have never renounced my faith in God. I have risen against his justice, protested his silence, and sometimes his absence. But my anger rises up within faith and not outside it. I admit that this is hardly an original position. It is part of Jewish tradition, But in these matters, I have never sought originality. On the contrary, I have always aspired to follow in the footsteps of my father and those who went before him. Moreover, the texts cite many occasions when prophets and sages rebelled against the lack of divine interference in human affairs during times of persecution. Abraham and Moses, Jeremiah and Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev teach us that it is permissible for man to accuse God, provided it be done in the name of faith in God. If that hurts, so be it. Sometimes we must accept the pain of faith so as not to lose it. And if that makes the tragedy of the believer more devastating than that of the non-believer, so be it. To proclaim one's faith within the barbed wire of Auschwitz may well represent a double tragedy of the believer and his creator alike. Now, he is really an authentic Jew, but says in his book, A Jew Today, I'm going to just give you some of my favorite quotes. The Jew's mission was never to make the world Jewish, but rather to make it more human. And so he became much of a humanist, an activist. Somebody told him about the Mosquito Indians. Has anyone heard of the Mosquito Indians in Honduras? So he went down to sort of be there with them. The Soviet Jewry, he went to Moscow way back in the 60s and wrote his book, The Jews of Silence. Let's see, what I've hoped for all my life is that my past should not become your children's future. And then, whatever you do, remember the moral dimension. This is what he would say to his students. If you study engineering or architecture or the arts or music, literature, whatever you do in your life, remember always that there must be a moral dimension. And lastly, this is what we must do, not to sleep well when people suffer anywhere in the world. So, the museum again. It opened in 1993, and from the moment it opened, there were something like 2 million visitors a year from all over the world. This is not a Jewish museum. This is in Washington. That was the nice thing about building it. They found the site right there in the heart of Washington, and 2 million visitors a year. They created a committee of conscience so that there would be people who would go to troubled places. As I said, the days of remembrance. And I went to the first one in the Capitol. They would have a ceremony in the Capitol where it was so powerful, so moving. The liberating troops, all the different troops, American troops, would march in with their flags. That's how it started, and it was And Wiesel was sitting up front on the stage, and there was a little boy next to him, and Carter wanted to know, who's that little boy? He said, it's my son. So Carter went like this, and Elisha, who was a little boy then, sat on the president's knee through this ceremony, and it was really something. I'm going to jump around a little bit. I want to just read the citation for the Nobel Peace Prize for 1986. The Norwegian Nobel Committee has resolved that the Nobel Peace Prize for 1986 should be awarded to the author, Elie Wiesel. It is the committee's opinion that Elie Wiesel has emerged as one of the most important spiritual leaders and guides in an age when violence, repression, and racism continue to characterize the world. Wiesel is a messenger to mankind. His message is one of peace, atonement, and human dignity. His belief that the forces fighting evil in the world can be victorious is a hard-won belief. His message is based on his own personal experience of total humiliation and of the utter contempt for humanity shown in Hitler's death camps. The message is in the form of a testimony repeated and deepened through the works of a great author. Wiesel's commitment, which originated in the sufferings of the Jewish people, has been widened to embrace all repressed peoples and races. The Norwegian Nobel Committee believes that Elie Wiesel, with his message and through his practical work in the cause of peace, is a convincing spokesman for the view of mankind and for the unlimited humanitarianism which are at all times necessary for a lasting and just peace. So I hope you got the gist of it. His son is almost the age Elie was when he was deported. I think his son is 14 here, and Elie was deported to Auschwitz at age 15. So I had a story about apartheid, which I love. It's my own guess, but take it or leave it. He, at a conference, he was with Nelson Mandela and Alex de Klerk from South Africa. Apartheid was still going. He told the two of them, "You two go into a room and speak to one another." And very shortly after that, apartheid was done. And I just like to think that he had something to do with it. I don't know. His teaching he started off at CUNY, the City University of New York. He was a distinguished visiting professor at Florida International. He taught at the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale. He was a visiting scholar there for a year. He was a fellow of Timothy Dwight College at Yale. And John Silver spirited him away from New York, from City College, and in 1976 until he retired officially. I'm not sure exactly when the official date was. There was no retirement party. He came to mine, and I remember saying to him, "I thought I'd be coming to your retirement party, not you to mine." But he didn't believe in retirement, and I think ill health really took over, and his doctors did not want him to fly from Boston to New York. He never moved to Boston. Originally, I think he thought he would, but his son Elisha who was named for his Wiesel's father. His father was Shlomo Elisha, and his son is Elisha Shlomo. Elisha was in the Ramaz school in New York, and he was happy there. And so they basically stayed in New York. And New York is a lot easier to travel all over the world from. And he did that all over the world in terms of the world picture. He testified at the United Nations Tribunal when Karadzic, was tried because he had been to Bosnia and he was able to do that. He testified at the Klaus Barbie trial in Lyon, France. Barbie was the SS chief, the SS chief in Lyon during the war. He's had all kinds of honors from the Nobel Peace Prize, I guess, is the highest in the world, but he did get the Medal of Liberty Award, which given by President Reagan to only 11 foreign-born U.S. citizens. That was at the Statue of Liberty, also in the same year as the Nobel, 1986. The U.S. Congressional Gold Medal, I think I mentioned that he got at the White House. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded by President Bush in '92. He is a Grand Officer of the Légion d'honneur, the Legion of Honor in France. He won Brazil's highest distinction, the Star of Romania, presented by President Iliescu of Romania, Commander's Cross from the Republic of Hungary, the King Hussein Award of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, on and on and on. And the latest one that I know of, the two latest ones. One was he was declared an honorary knight by the Queen of England. So he's called Sir Elie in England, not here, but there. When you're a foreign citizen and you get a knighthood, that's what happens. And the most recent one, actually, is he won the State of Israel Presidential Medal of the State of Israel. He's been awarded over 125 honorary degrees. But I've heard him say that the first one is the one that matters. But he's won 125, think of it, 125 from universities across the world. I mean, really, from Kenyon College in Ohio to the Sorbonne, all over. Back to the world leadership. When he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he took the money. At that time, it was a lot less than it is now. Of course, in 86, I guess it was worth more, but it was, I think, $280,000. He took that and with his wife started the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, which is located in New York. And they run conferences. I mean, it's kind of like the museum. They want to do conferences so people can learn the anatomy of hate, against anti-Semitism and so forth. He was chosen for a special 50th edition, as he was included as one of 50 great Americans in Who's Who in America, 1995. Honorary citizen of the city of Aix-en-Provence, honorary citizen of the city of Santa Margherita, Italy. So all of these awards mean he went to all of these places. He was constantly traveling. And I just wanted to say that he's published more, I did say he was published more than 60 books, but the last book is called Open Heart, and he had open heart surgery a few years ago. Before he left the hospital, he had the manuscript done in French. And I wanted to say about his writing, this is a first edition of Night, which is not called Night. It was written well before Night, and it's in Yiddish. It was published in Argentina. It was 900 pages. This Yiddish has been cut down already. And then when he was in, this is the last story I'll tell, okay? In France, I told you he was a journalist. And it was 10 years after his liberation. One of the people he interviewed was Francois Mauriac, the Catholic theologian, Francois Mauriac. Great Catholic theologian being interviewed by this Jewish survivor. And Wiesel tells the story that Mauriac kept talking about Jesus on the cross and the suffering of Jesus and on and on and on about all the suffering of Jesus. And Elie said, how he had the guts to do it, he said to him, Monsieur Mauriac, I knew many children who suffered even more, but I don't talk about them. And Mauriac said to him, well, you must. And he then wrote Night in French, La Nuit. That was 1958. And then it was published, it was translated into English in 1960. Very few copies sold. The first printing was just, very small. It wasn't until Oprah that it sold over 1 million copies. Actually, I'm sorry, 6 million. There was a distinguishing figure, 6 million copies when Oprah had it on her show. And he didn't tell his publisher he was going to be on Oprah. The book sold out all across the country because he had no idea what power this woman had. So there it was. Anyway, I could go on for another hour, but I'm stopping right now because I'm sure you have some Q&A.